Have you ever been the shadow in someone else's spotlight? Forced to watch the person who tormented you claim everything you ever desired? No one will ever choose you, her sister sneered, adjusting her diamonds. But she was wrong, because tonight, the most powerful man in England is looking right past the diamonds and walking straight toward the shadows. The damp chill of an 1888 London autumn clung to the frost-paned windows of the Sinclair townhouse on Mount Street. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating, thick with the scent of scorching curling irons, French lavender water, and the frantic, desperate energy of a family teetering on the very edge of ruin. The Sinclairs were an old name, but an empty vault. Lady Margaret Sinclair had spent the last of her deceased husband's dwindling fortune to ensure her eldest daughter, Rosamond, possessed a wardrobe that rivaled the visiting American heiresses. Genevieve Sinclair, 2 years younger and entirely overlooked, knelt on the cold hardwood floor, her mouth full of silver pins. "Careful, you clumsy little fool," Rosamond snapped, slapping Genevieve's shoulder. "That is Venetian lace. If you tear it, I will have Mother lock you in the attic for the remainder of the season." Genevieve said nothing. She merely removed a pin from her lips, her fingers deftly securing the hem of Rosamond's spectacular crimson silk gown. Rosamond was the undisputed diamond of Mayfair. With spun gold hair, porcelain skin, and a practiced, dazzling smile, she was bred for one singular purpose: to secure a title wealthy enough to pay off their father's crushing gambling debts. Genevieve, by contrast, was considered the family's tragic failure. Where Rosamond was gold and cream, Genevieve was stark and striking, raven-haired with eyes the color of a tumultuous winter sea. Her mother had long ago decided that Genevieve's sharp cheekbones and quiet, observant demeanor were too severe to attract a gentleman. Thus, Genevieve had been relegated to the role of an unpaid lady's maid, chaperone, and seamstress. "I hear the Duke of Blackwood has returned from his estates in the north," Lady Margaret declared, sweeping into the bedchamber. She gripped a pearl-encrusted fan, her eyes glittering with predatory ambition. "Alistair Montgomery. They say his wealth makes the Bank of England look like a pauper's purse. Tonight is his first ball in London in 5 years. Rosamond, darling, you must secure the first waltz. If you do, the season is ours." Rosamond preened in the tall floor mirror, admiring her reflection. She looked down at Genevieve, who was carefully gathering her sewing kit. A cruel, slow smile spread across Rosamond's lips. "Do try to stay out of sight tonight, Genevieve," Rosamond drawled, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "It is embarrassing enough that Mother forces you to attend these events to maintain the illusion of propriety. But in that dreadful, faded sage thing you insist on wearing, well, you look like a governess, and a plain one at that." Genevieve stood, her spine perfectly straight, despite the aching in her knees. "It is the only evening gown I possess, Rosamond." Rosamond laughed, a high, tinkling sound that had charmed countless lords but chilled Genevieve to the bone. "And it is all you shall ever need. Look at you. No dowry, no charm, no beauty. No one will choose you, Genevieve. You will grow old in the shadows of my estate, tending to my children, forever the spinster aunt." Genevieve lowered her eyes, not in submission, but to hide the sudden, fierce spark of rebellion within them. She excused herself, retreating to her tiny, draughty room at the end of the hall. As she pulled the faded, sage-green silk from her meagre armoire, Genevieve's fingers brushed against a heavy, velvet-bound book hidden beneath her linens. The leather cover was worn. The title, "The Complete Works of Lord Byron," embossed in fading gold. A small, secret smile broke through her guarded expression. Rosamond and her mother knew nothing of her life outside these walls. They knew nothing of her quiet escapes to Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, the only place where she felt truly alive, and they certainly knew nothing of the man she had met there 6 weeks ago. It had been pouring rain. Genevieve had sought refuge in the poetry section, her fingers tracing the spine of a rare first edition she could never afford. Another hand had reached for it at the exact same moment. She had looked up into the most intense, piercing dark eyes she had ever seen. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked from the rain, lacking the polished, overly perfumed veneer of the society lords. They had not exchanged names. Proper society would have deemed it scandalous. But in the quiet, dusty aisles of the bookshop, the strict rules of Mayfair seemed a world away. They had spent an hour debating Byron's fatalism, trading sharp, witty barbs that left Genevieve breathless. He had treated her not as a piece of furniture, nor as an ugly duckling, but as an intellectual equal. "You have a fierce mind," the stranger had murmured before she fled into the rain to avoid her mother's wrath for being tardy. "You're entirely a storm, aren't you? A quiet little storm." She had dreamed of that stranger every night since. She knew it was foolish. He was likely a wealthy merchant or an eccentric scholar passing through London. She would never see him again. But the memory of his gaze was a shield she wielded against Rosamond's cruelty. Genevieve slipped into the sage gown. It was old, yes? But over the last week, in the dead of night, she had painstakingly altered it. She had lowered the neckline just a fraction, tightened the bodice to perfectly accentuate her slender waist, and embroidered delicate, almost invisible silver threads along the hem that caught the light like morning dew. She did not look like a diamond. She looked like a secret. "Genevieve! The carriage!" her mother shrieked from the ground floor. Taking a deep breath, Genevieve descended the stairs, preparing to step into the lion's den of the Blackwood ball. Grosvenor Square was entirely choked with carriages, the snorting of thoroughbred horses and the shouting of footmen echoing into the foggy London night. The Blackwood townhouse was a palatial fortress of white stone, blazing with the light of 1,000 gas lamps. It was the most coveted invitation of the decade. Only the absolute elite of the British aristocracy and those clinging desperately to its fringes, like the Sinclairs, were permitted entry. As Genevieve followed in the wake of her mother and sister, the sheer opulence of the estate took her breath away. The grand entrance hall was lined with marble statues and cascading arrangements of rare, white orchids that filled the air with a heavy, intoxicating sweetness. They surrendered their cloaks, and as they reached the threshold of the grand ballroom, the major domo struck his staff against the marble floor. "Lady Margaret Sinclair, Miss Rosamond Sinclair, Miss Genevieve Sinclair." Genevieve flinched slightly at the announcement of her name, entirely accustomed to being ignored. The ballroom was a sea of glittering jewels, stark black tailcoats, and vibrant rustling silks. The elite of London were already forming their vicious little circles. Over by the champagne fountain, Genevieve spotted Lady Harriet Cavendish, leaning in to whisper viciously behind her fan to Lord Reginald Fitzroy, a notorious gossip. They were undoubtedly placing wagers on who would capture the Duke's attention tonight. "Stand up straight, Rosamond," Lady Margaret hissed, practically shoving her eldest daughter toward the center of the room. "Make sure the light catches your necklace. Genevieve, go find a chair near the potted palms and do not make a spectacle of yourself." Genevieve gladly obeyed. She navigated the perimeter of the room, slipping unnoticed behind the throngs of dancing couples, finally finding a secluded alcove partially obscured by massive ferns. From here, she could observe the spectacle in peace. Rosamond was in her element. Within minutes, she was surrounded by a gaggle of admirers, her crimson dress acting as a beacon. She laughed at their dull jokes, her eyes constantly darting toward the grand, sweeping staircase at the far end of the room, waiting for the prize. An hour passed. The tension in the ballroom grew palpable. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Montgomery, was famously elusive. Rumours swirled that he had spent the last 5 years expanding his empire in the colonies, growing harder, richer, and more ruthless. He was 32, unmarried, and the absolute apex of the social hierarchy. Suddenly, the orchestra, which had been playing a lively Strauss waltz, faltered. The conductor tapped his baton. A profound, echoing silence rippled across the vast ballroom, a hush so sudden and complete it felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. Genevieve leaned forward, peering through the fronds of the palm. At the top of the grand staircase stood a man. He did not wear the ostentatious medals or colourful sashes favoured by the older peers. He was dressed in impeccably tailored, stark black evening wear that emphasised the broad, powerful line of his shoulders. His dark hair was brushed back, revealing a face composed of harsh angles and uncompromising authority. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a predator surveying a flock of sheep. Genevieve's heart stopped. The breath vanished from her lungs, replaced by a cold, sharp shock. It was him, the man from Hatchard's bookshop, the stranger who had debated Byron with her in the rain. He was not a merchant. He was not a scholar. He was Alistair Montgomery, the Duke of Blackwood. Panic, absolute and blinding, seized Genevieve. He cannot see me, she thought wildly, shrinking back into the shadows of the alcove. If he recognizes me, if he speaks to me, Mother will demand to know how we are acquainted. Rosamond will destroy me. The Duke began his descent. The crowd practically parted like the Red Sea. Society matrons shoved their daughters forward, desperate to catch his eye. The Duke ignored them all. His dark, piercing gaze swept over the ballroom with an air of profound boredom, until his eyes landed on the cluster of people near the centre. Rosamond was standing exactly in his path. She had positioned herself perfectly, dismissing Lord Fitzroy with a wave of her fan. As the Duke approached, Rosamond sank into a flawless, impossibly deep curtsy, her crimson silk pooling around her like spilled blood. "Your Grace," Rosamond murmured, her voice carrying beautifully in the quiet room. She looked up through her lashes, wearing the smile that had broken a dozen hearts. "Welcome back to London. It is an honour." The entire ballroom held its breath. Lady Margaret, standing a few feet away, looked ready to faint with triumph. Genevieve watched from her hiding place, a bitter ache rising in her throat. Of course, this was how the world worked. The prince always noticed the diamond. The Duke paused. He looked down at Rosamond. The silence stretched, tight as a violin string. "Miss Sinclair, I presume," the Duke said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that sent a shiver down Genevieve's spine. "Yes, Your Grace," Rosamond breathed, rising gracefully. She extended a gloved hand, fully expecting him to request her dance card. "I was just saying to my mother." "Excuse me," the Duke interrupted, his tone utterly devoid of warmth. He did not take her hand. He did not even offer her a polite nod. Instead, he stepped neatly around her. A collective, barely concealed gasp rippled through the upper echelons of Mayfair. Rosamond froze, her extended hand left suspended in the empty air, her perfect smile shattering into an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. Lady Margaret actually dropped her fan. The Duke did not stop. He continued his steady, commanding stride across the polished marble floor. He was walking away from the centre of the room. He was walking away from the heiresses, the daughters of earls, and the shimmering jewels of society. He was walking directly toward the shadows. Genevieve pressed herself against the cold silk wallpaper, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. No, no, please, she prayed silently. But his eyes, those dark, piercing eyes she remembered so vividly, were locked onto hers with the intensity of a predator who had finally found his prey. The crowd parted before him, heads turning, whispers erupting like dry brush catching fire. Where is he going? Who is over there? Is that the other Sinclair girl? The Duke stopped directly in front of the potted palms. He looked down at Genevieve, taking in the simple, faded sage-green gown, her pale face, and her wide, terrified grey eyes. For the first time that evening, the harsh lines of his face softened, and a small, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. He bowed perfectly, extending a large, gloved hand toward her. "I believe," the Duke of Blackwood said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the dead-silent ballroom heard every single word. "You owe me a debate on Byron, my little storm. Shall we take the floor?" For a long, agonizing second, Genevieve could not breathe. The entire ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. Hundreds of eyes bored into her, heavy with shock, judgment, and venomous curiosity. Over Alistair Montgomery's broad shoulder, she could see her mother, Lady Margaret, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck, while Rosamond's face had contorted into an ugly, mottled mask of pure outrage. "Take my hand," his dark eyes seemed to command, though his expression remained unreadable to the gawking crowd. Driven by a sudden, reckless surge of adrenaline and a desperate desire to escape the crushing weight of her family's stares, Genevieve placed her trembling, bare hand into his large, white-gloved one. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid, an anchor in the storm of the ballroom. Alistair smoothly drew her out of the shadows. The orchestra, utterly terrified by the unprecedented social breach, fumbled their instruments. The conductor frantically tapped his music stand, and they lurched into a dramatic, sweeping Viennese waltz. Alistair pulled her into the center of the floor, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back, right over the hidden silver threads she had so carefully embroidered. They began to turn. "You," Genevieve gasped, her voice barely a whisper above the soaring violins. "You are the Duke of Blackwood." "And you are Miss Genevieve Sinclair," Alistair replied, steering her effortlessly past a stunned Lady Dalrymple, whose jaw was practically resting on her diamond necklace. The quiet storm in the faded sage gown, though I must confess, the gown is far more captivating tonight. "You deceived me," she said, her grey eyes flashing with sudden, protective anger. She tried to pull back, but his grip was ironclad. In Hatchard's, "You let me believe you were just a stranger, a scholar." "I never claimed to be a scholar, Genevieve," he murmured, using her Christian name with a shocking, intimate ease that sent heat rushing to her cheeks. "I merely engaged in a debate about Byron. It was you who assumed I was an ordinary man, and for an hour you gave me the extraordinary gift of allowing me to be one." "My mother is going to kill me," Genevieve breathed, glancing toward the edge of the floor. Lady Margaret was furiously whispering to Lord Harrington, her face purple with rage. Rosamond looked as though she was preparing to storm the dance floor and physically tear Genevieve away. "She brought us here so Rosamond could ensnare you. You have ruined everything." Alistair's eyes darkened, the easy amusement vanishing, replaced by a cold, terrifying sharpness. "Your mother and sister have ruined themselves, Genevieve. I merely provided the stage for their final act." Genevieve faltered, missing a step. Alistair caught her smoothly, pulling her a fraction closer. "What do you mean?" "Did you truly believe our meeting in the bookshop was a coincidence?" Alistair asked softly. The waltz carried them in sweeping, dizzying circles beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers. "I returned to London for one purpose: to settle my affairs. Among my recent acquisitions was the London and Provincial Bank. When I reviewed the ledgers, I found a staggering mountain of debt attached to the Sinclair name. Mortgages, promissory notes, gambling markers left by your late father." Genevieve lowered her gaze, shame burning in her throat. "I know of the debts. It is why Rosamond must marry well. We are destitute." "You are not destitute," Alistair corrected sharply. "Your mother is. Your sister is." Genevieve looked up, confused. "I do not understand." Alistair leaned in, his lips brushing dangerously close to her ear. The scent of sandalwood and bergamot surrounded her, steadying her trembling nerves. "When I saw the extent of the Sinclair debts, I retained the services of Sir George Lewis." Genevieve gasped. Even isolated in her attic room, she knew that name. Sir George Lewis of Lewis and Lewis was the most feared and brilliant solicitor in all of England. He kept the secrets of the Prince of Wales himself, and when he investigated a family, reputations were shattered beyond repair. "Sir George dug into your father's estate," Alistair continued, his voice a low rumble beneath the music. "Lord Richard Sinclair was a foolish man, but he was not entirely blind to his wife's cruelty. 3 weeks before he died, he altered his will. He executed a secret codicil. He knew Lady Margaret would squander whatever was left on Rosamond's vanity. So he left the only unentailed, debt-free asset he possessed, the sprawling, highly profitable Trevelyan Manor in Cornwall, along with a hidden trust of £50,000, entirely to you." The ballroom faded away. The music became a dull roar in Genevieve's ears. To me? But my mother said we had nothing. She said the entire estate was tied to the debts. "Because your mother is a fraud, Genevieve," Alistair stated, his tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. "When your father died, Lady Margaret found the codicil before it could be properly filed at Somerset House. She bribed a lowly clerk to bury the paperwork and kept the trust for herself, intending to use it as Rosamond's secret dowry once she secured a duke. A duke like me." Tears pricked Genevieve's eyes, a chaotic mix of profound betrayal and blinding, dizzying liberation. All those years, the cold attic, the unpaid labor, the constant, suffocating humiliation. Her mother had stolen her independence to fund Rosamond's cruelty. "Why are you telling me this?" Genevieve whispered, her voice cracking. "Why not simply send your solicitor to arrest her?" The music reached its crescendo. Alistair spun her outward, then caught her firmly against his chest as the final note echoed through the silent, captivated ballroom. "Because," Alistair said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion, "I wanted to see the quiet storm unleash her lightning, and I wanted to ensure that when you finally walked out of their shadows, the entire world was watching." Alistair did not release her when the music ended. Instead, he tucked her hand firmly into the crook of his arm and led her straight off the dance floor, ignoring the chaotic buzzing of the aristocrats. He guided her down a long, opulent corridor lined with Renaissance portraits, stopping before a set of heavy mahogany doors. He pushed them open to reveal his private study, a magnificent, 2-story library smelling of old paper and leather. Standing by the marble fireplace was a severe-looking man in a meticulously tailored grey suit holding a thick leather briefcase. "Genevieve, this is Sir George Lewis," Alistair said, closing the doors behind them with a definitive thud. Sir George bowed deeply. "An honour, Miss Sinclair." I have the documents regarding Trevelyan Manor right here, bearing your late father's seal and signature." Before Genevieve could speak, the library doors burst open. Lady Margaret stormed into the room, her face a mask of aristocratic fury, with Rosamond practically stepping on her heels. "Genevieve, get away from him this instant!" Lady Margaret shrieked, entirely abandoning her carefully cultivated societal poise. She pointed a shaking, jewel-encrusted finger at the Duke. "Your Grace, I demand to know the meaning of this spectacle. You have humiliated my eldest daughter. You have made a mockery of my family by parading this simpleton around the floor." Rosamond sniffed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He is only pitying her, mother. Look at her dreadful dress. The Duke is merely playing a cruel joke." Alistair's presence seemed to expand, filling the room with an icy, terrifying authority. He stepped in front of Genevieve, shielding her. "Lady Margaret," Alistair said, his voice deadly quiet, "you will lower your voice in my home, and you will address the master of Trevelyan Manor with the respect she is owed." The blood drained entirely from Lady Margaret's face. She staggered back a step, her fan clattering onto the Persian rug. Rosamond looked between them, bewildered. "Trevelyan Manor? Mother, what is he talking about? That property was lost to the banks." Sir George Lewis stepped forward, opening his briefcase. "Actually, Miss Rosamond, it was not. I hold in my hand the true legal codicil of Lord Richard Sinclair. It leaves the manor and a trust of £50,000 exclusively to Miss Genevieve. I also hold sworn affidavits from the clerk Lady Margaret bribed to suppress this document." "Lies!" Lady Margaret gasped, clutching her throat. "It is a forgery. I am a peeress of the realm. You cannot speak to me this way." "I am Sir George Lewis, madam," the solicitor replied dryly. "I can speak to you however I please, especially when I hold enough evidence to see you hanged for fraud, forgery and embezzlement at Newgate Prison." Rosamond turned to her mother, her beautiful face twisting in horror. "Mother, is this true? Did you steal from the estate?" Lady Margaret had no words. She stared at the thick parchment in Sir George's hands, her grand ambitions collapsing into ash. She looked at Genevieve, but for the first time in her life, there was no disdain in her eyes. There was only raw, absolute terror. Alistair turned to Genevieve. He gently took her shoulders, his gaze softening. "The debts your father accrued are held by my bank, Genevieve. Your trust fund is untouched, but your mother's London townhouse, the carriages, her jewels, they all belong to me. I will call in the debts tomorrow, and she will be ruined. Unless you wish otherwise. The choice is entirely yours." The room fell deathly silent. Genevieve stepped out from behind the Duke. She looked at her mother, who was trembling violently, and then at Rosamond, whose porcelain beauty suddenly looked incredibly fragile and cheap. "No one will choose you," Genevieve repeated softly, echoing the vicious words Rosamond had spoken only hours ago. "That is what you told me, Rosamond. You told me I would die a spinster in the shadows of your estate." Rosamond swallowed hard, unable to meet Genevieve's eyes. "Genevieve, please," Lady Margaret whimpered, falling to her knees on the rug, her silk skirts pooling around her. "I am your mother. You cannot let them send me to prison. I did it to protect the family name." Genevieve stared down at the woman who had treated her like a servant. She felt a profound, heavy sadness. But beneath it, an unbreakable spine of steel. "You did it to protect your pride, mother," Genevieve said, her voice clear and steady. She looked at Sir George. "Do not send her to Newgate. The scandal would be too vulgar." Lady Margaret let out a sob of relief, but Genevieve held up her hand. "However, I will not protect your lifestyle. Sir George, the Duke may call in his debts. Take the London house. Take the jewels. Take the carriages." "Genevieve, no!" Rosamond shrieked. "Where will we go?" "You will go to the small, draughty dower cottage on the edge of the Trevelyan estate," Genevieve said coldly. "I will grant you a tiny allowance, enough for plain food, coarse wool, and absolutely no servants. You will learn to sew your own hems, Rosamond, and if you ever attempt to contact high society again, I will have Sir George release the affidavits." Lady Margaret collapsed into weeping hysterics, pulling at her hair. Rosamond stood frozen in absolute ruin. "Sir George, escort them out through the servants' entrance," Alistair commanded. "They are no longer welcome in my home." Within moments, the library was cleared of the weeping women, leaving only the crackle of the fireplace and the heavy, sweet silence of victory. Genevieve stood perfectly still, her heart pounding. It was over. She was free. She owned herself. Alistair stepped behind her, gently resting his hands on her waist. "You were magnificent," he whispered, pressing a soft kiss to the crown of her dark hair. "A true storm." Genevieve leaned back against his solid chest, finally letting out a breath she felt she had been holding for 20 years. "You orchestrated all of this. You bought my family's debts just to corner my mother." "I would have bought the Bank of England if it meant freeing you from that attic," Alistair admitted, gently turning her to face him. He reached up, his thumb softly tracing her sharp, beautiful cheekbone. "When I met you in that bookshop, Genevieve, I saw a woman whose mind outshone every diamond in Mayfair. I did not pity you. I recognized you." Genevieve looked up into his dark, fierce eyes. "And what happens now, Your Grace?" Alistair smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression that finally melted the harsh lines of his face. He stepped back and bowed, extending his hand just as he had in the ballroom. "Now, Miss Sinclair, the master of Trevelyan Manor allows me the distinct honor of courting her, properly this time, with no shadows to hide in." Genevieve looked at his outstretched hand. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking across her face, illuminating the quiet room. She was no longer a secret, and she was no longer in the shadows. She had been chosen, not for a title, and not for a dowry, but simply because she was the storm he had been waiting for. Did Genevieve's triumph over her cruel family leave you entirely breathless? Sometimes the very quietest storms leave the absolute most beautiful aftermath. If you loved this dramatic tale of hidden inheritances, scandalous twists, and fierce romance, please hit that like button. Share this video with fellow historical drama lovers, and always subscribe to our channel for more spectacular, real-life inspired stories of true love and wonderfully sweet, ultimate revenge.